History 1, Unit 2, Part 1 will begin with basically the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, whichever you want to call it, and the impact it had on the relationship between the colonists and the British government. Now, as a refresher, the French and Indian War was a war between the colonists allied with the British and the French and Indians in the Ohio Valley, or across the demarcation line that you can see, that purple line that runs down what is really basically the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains to some extent, or the western side of the Appalachian Mountains. But as British settlers had moved across that line into the frontier, they had ran up against resistance from the French and the Indians, and this led to a broader war. And after the war, the British declared a proclamation line of 1763, which basically the British told the colonists that they could not settle over that line, on the other side of that line, without explicit permission from the British government. And of course, they resented that greatly. There were other things too, that other policies too, that the British changed after the French and Indian War. First and most importantly, the British implemented a policy of direct taxation, and that is something that they had never ever done to the colonists in the 150 or so years that the British colonies had existed in the Americas. The British had always created wealth and made their money by taxing trade, placing tariffs on goods that entered British ports or left British ports or colonial ports, but never had they ever directly taxed the colonists in the purchasing of goods from the store for their end use. But that all changed after the War of 18. Pardon me, the French and Indian War, when the British decided that the colonists, because in their minds the British thought that the colonists had started the war, therefore that they should pay for the war and pay for the administration of their own colonies. So they began implementing direct taxes on the purchase of sugar. The Stamp Act placed taxes, or you had to purchase a stamp tax for any official documents that were used in the colonies, and these taxes hit the pocketbooks of the colonists, especially the Stamp Act, which all correspondence during this period, during the colonial period, was done on paper. You didn't have telephones, you didn't have emails. Everything was done by paper, and every single piece of official document that was used in these correspondence were taxed, and so it had an economic impact on the entire colonies. And with these, protests arisen. Protests began to arise with the mantra, or the motto of no taxation without representation. No taxation without representation. Basically, this idea underlines the Lockean principles that governments cannot take your life, liberty, or property without the consent of the governed. And by taxing, you're taking somebody's property, yet the colonists argue that there are no colonists in Parliament who are making the laws directly taxing the colonists. So there is no representation of colonists in the Parliament, in the government of England. Therefore, they are being taxed without representation, which is a violation of their natural rights, as spelled out by John Locke early on, and of course by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. And this quote by John Adams, really kind of encapsulates the argument. No freeman should be subject to any tax to which he has not given his own consent. And Parliament is taxing them, and the colonists have no voice in Parliament, and therefore they have not given their consent. So as the tensions rise, you'll see events happen that lead to the greater division between the colonists and their and in Great Britain. You got the Stamp Act Congress. First of all, was the first real time that the colonies, the separate colonies, had come together uh, for a common purpose. They had all kind of existed independently. Massachusetts, New York, South Carolina, Virginia. They were all kind of independent of each other because they had, they mind their own business. Yet now they have a common problem, and that is the problem of this direct taxation without representation and the rising tensions with Great Britain. Of course, these tensions will lead to bloodshed with the Boston Massacre in 1770. Also, the tensions will be heightened with the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where the colonists were protesting the the policy of the British that forced them to buy tea from a specific company, the East India Tea Company, because they were basically going bankrupt. And so, in order to save the company, they passed a law requiring colonists to only buy their tea from that company. Of course, the colonists resented that. I mean, the tea didn't cost any more than it did from anybody else, but they just resented the idea that they were forced to buy that tea from that company. And so they dressed up as Indians, some of the more radical ones, dressed up as Indians, boarded one of the ships in Boston Harbor that was carrying tea, and dumped the tea into the harbor. Of course, the reaction was from Great Britain was very quick, and they passed what's called the coercive acts, or what the colonists would call the intolerable acts, which basically shut down Boston Harbor until the colonists paid for the tea. And it was under this event that the First Continental Congress convened, with all of the colonies present, and the colonists issued a Declaration of Rights and Resolves that would be sent to the King and Parliament, basically spelling out their grievances, uh, and asking, and really what they're wanting is everything to go back to like it was before the French and Indian War, before the direct taxation. Uh, and they said that if the demands aren't met, these demands that we want from the King and Parliament aren't met, we will meet again in the next year. And it was just about time to meet again when what we call the shots heard around the world happened at Lexington Concord. It was the first formal uh, skirmish between the British and the colonists, whereas the Boston Tea Party was kind of an accident. It wasn't planned. The Lexington Concord consisted of the British attempting to uh, take armor and gunpowder away from the colonists, and the colonists ambushed them to stop them from doing so, with dead on both sides. And it's at this point that the relationship between the British and the colonists is just about irrevocably broken. So with the Lexington Concord happening just a month prior, the Continental Congress meets again for what will be known as the Second Continental Congress. Of course, they're meeting in Philadelphia. This one meets from 1775 through 1776, and they make one last attempt to resolve their issues with the King and Parliament by sending something called the Olive Branch Petition, which once again states that they are loyal British subjects, but they just feel like that their natural rights, have been violated with the taxation policy, and also arguing the unfairness of the presence of the British military. Uh, while they're debating all these problems, they all understand that the possibility is there that eventually they will declare independence, and they will and if they do so, they will end up fighting a war against the British. And so they name George Washington, as commander in chief of the really the non-existent at the time a Continental Army. Of course, he'll organize the different militias into the Continental Army later. But Washington and the rest of the members of the Continental Congress understand that it's gotten so bad that they might have to defend themselves from the British. It is at this point that Virginia stands up, a little bit later and calls for independence. Richard Henry Lee stands up and says, look, we are too different from. Basically, says, in a nutshell, we are too different from British now as it is. We can never reconcile with them, and we must go ahead and declare independence. And thus begins a big debate in the Continental Congress and across the different colonies over whether they should declare independence or not. Because you know, if they declare independence, they are basically breaking away from their mother country, and that is considered treason by the mother country, and that, of course, leads to war. And those that commit treason, the most common punishment for those people is death by hanging. And so, if they take that step to declare independence and they don't win the war, well, they will all be executed. And this is a great debate going on. And also another problem is that many of the states, especially the southern states, have very very close economic ties with England, and their whole economic foundation is based on their trade relationship with England, and they fear that that might be affected. But anyway, before they adjourn the Second Continental Congress, for that at least that session of the Congress, a committee is formed to draft a declaration in case a Declaration of Independence is needed, and it is, of course, it was a committee of multiple members, including Ben Franklin and John Adams, but Thomas Jefferson is the main author of the Declaration of Independence, uh, and uh, and finally, after much debate, uh, much arguing, uh, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. Of course, once the Declaration of Independence was ratified, that means they were at war with England. And so you had different factions within the colonies, or now the states. Once they declared independence, they called themselves states and no longer colonies. But the basic dividing line was between the revolutionaries who supported independence from England and the loyalists who did not support it and wanted to remain loyal, therefore the name loyalists, loyal to England. And these were stark divisions among the colonists, and they took it seriously, and they truly believed in what they you know the path that they think that the America should go. Now, one of the pivotal moments and pivotal events that happened that persuaded many people who were maybe on the fence and weren't sure which side they wanted to support, revolutionaries or loyalists, was the publication of a pamphlet called Common Sense by Thomas Paine. And this pamphlet, which can be found online anywhere and can be read, and I encourage you all to read it, spells out why uh, the Americans should declare independence and become independent from England. And then, of course, there's the issue of slaves in the Revolution. Uh, many, of course, the southern states, but many, even in the North, there were slaves, uh, and the slaves, of course, for the most part, the majority of them supported Great Britain. Uh, Great Britain had abolished, by this time, Great Britain had already abolished slavery themselves. And the slaves, of course, if they fought to defend the freedom of the states or the colonies, whichever one you call it, they were basically fighting to support and to continue their own status as slaves. And so most slaves did not support the revolution. Um, Now, building an army, the British was already the strongest military on the face of the earth, basically. Especially they had the strongest navy, but they also had a battle-tested, uh, strong army, because, of course, the British have been fighting the French for centuries. But the British had their organized, well-seasoned army and navy, and the Americans had basically militias, which are just informal uh, groups that can be called up at a moment's notice locally to protect against Indian invasions or whatever, and so really the British had quite the advantage with regard to military skill. Of course, more men. The British had more men actively in the army. Of course, the Revolution would bring out uh, Americans, revolutionaries, to fight the war. And of course, members of the militias would, for the most part, join in the fight. But often, once they see the horrors of the war and see how long it's going to last, they're going to desert and go back. The British had more weapons and better training. But so those are two advantages of the British: men, weapons, and training. But there are two advantages that cannot be uh, understated, or pardon me, they cannot be overstated, and that is that the revolutionaries had knowledge of the terrain. They knew every river, every creek, every hiding place because that's where they grew up and that's where they hunted. They knew the terrain. And also, they had the motivation of fighting for a cause. They felt like they were fighting for a just cause, whereas basically the British Army were just professionals fighting because they were getting paid to. And if you look through the history of war, the human history of war, those generally with the most motivation win. When they have something to fight for that's greater than just treasure, greater than just money. And they had, the revolutionaries, American revolutionaries, had the motivation of fighting for their freedom and fighting for the principles of natural rights. Initially, the goal of the British in the American Revolution was to isolate New England. They believed that the troublemakers, for the most part, were in New England, especially in the Boston area of Massachusetts. So their goal was to isolate New England, and they believed that by doing so and cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies would basically give up. The colonies would not see the fight as worth it, and so therefore shortening the war quite a bit. And early on, it was not very good for the colonists, or not the colonists, but for the revolutionaries. The revolutionaries were defeated in New York in July of 1776, and some of these earliest battles, excuse me, led to low morale, lots of desertions, because a lot of these were just militia members from the states who just thought it might be kind of a neat experience to go fight in a war, but once they realized how difficult it is and the things you have to put up with in war, they began to desert and go back to their homes. And they also had problems recruiting, even offering bonuses to come in, land and other things as an enticement. They still had problems recruiting. And so the first part of the war, it was not looking good for the Americans. But around Christmas 1776, um, Washington famously crosses the Delaware into Trenton, New Jersey, and takes out a battalion. I guess not a battalion, but a unit of Hessian mercenaries that the British had hired for the war, and that was a huge boost to the morale. It showed that it shows that the Americans could win potentially, and that led to some changing fortunes. The British plan to isolate New England was to send General Burgoyne from the north down and Howe from the south up to kind of squeeze um, New England. Uh, but Burgoyne loses a major battle at Saratoga, and that's one of the turning points of the war, because it's at Saratoga. Of course, during this time, the Americans had been debating and talking to the French about allying with the French, and so and having the French support our effort, or support the American effort, finance the American effort, and the French weren't real willing to join forces with the Americans because they didn't think they could win, first of all, and they wanted some assurance that the American fighting forces were actually viable against the British, and the win at Saratoga actually is the turning point which leads the French to come in on the side of the Americans and support them. Uh, but even with this good news, had a tough winter at Valley Forge, where smallpox swept through the barracks and the tents, and decimated, just really decimated Washington's army. But the French alliance had been made, and that's going to be a very important factor in the outcome of the war. This map just kind of shows where loyalists and patriot strongholds were, and also where the major contested areas were. The green were patriot strongholds, where a significant majority of the population were for independence from England. That kind of rusty color, that reddish rusty color, are loyalist strongholds. That's where the British had strong loyalty with the majority of the population in those areas. Um, and then the blue area were contested areas, a lot of backcountry areas where there was a lot of really brutal fighting between the loyalists and the patriots. Now, with all this going on, the British decide to take the battle to the south. They believe, and they ended up being wrong in their belief, that they had great support in a large swath of the South. They believed that there was a lot of loyalists that would take up arms against the Patriots, or at least not fight the British. So they moved southward into into the southern states, and early on they had some relatively easy victories, where Cornwallis takes Charleston and Savannah. And there's, as I mentioned before, there's brutal backcountry fighting. Uh, I mean, torture and executions, all those things, in the fighting between Americans. That the loyalists versus the patriots or the revolutionaries. But one of the things about fighting in the South, and especially going into the backcountry, is that it creates long supply lines that have to be maintained and protected. And also, it's brutal fighting in some very rugged country, and all of this together is taking a toll on the British morale. They fight for pay. They don't really see this as a cause like the Americans do. They're just doing it because it's their job, and it begins to wear on them, and their morale begins to falter, and their motivation begins to falter. Uh, now, George Washington and General Greene, they flee inland. They know that the supply lines are going to be the most difficult thing for the British to maintain. So as they flee inland and the British chasing them, the British have to maintain supplies coming in from the ports along the coast. And those supply lines have to be protected, and that takes people. And so that makes it very difficult for them to continue to chase Washington into the backcountry. Uh, Cornwallis, after taking Charleston and Savannah, moves up into Virginia and camps at Yorktown. Unbeknownst to him, Washington has trapped them against the water on the land side, and the French are bringing in reinforcements on the water, and they will end up surrounding Cornwallis and the majority of the British army at Yorktown. And there's really nothing that Cornwallis can do at that point except surrender. And he surrenders, and it's a surrender that shocks not only the British, but it shocks the world, because nobody really expected the Americans to be able to defeat the British in the American Revolution. But they did. A lot of luck involved, a lot of strategy involved, but nonetheless, in October of 1781, the British surrendered to Washington at Yorktown. Of course, after the surrender, at the end of a war, you have to sign a treaty, and the treaty that ends the American Revolution is the Treaty of Paris, negotiated and signed in 1783. It was negotiated on the American side by Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams. And basically, the content of the treaty consists of American independence from British rule. They're no longer a British colony. American expansion west to the Mississippi River and north to the Great Lakes. Freedom to navigate the Mississippi River. Of course, this will create some tension with the French and the Spanish, who are on the other side of the Mississippi River. In this treaty, Spain retains control of Florida. It's an important point for future reference. And then no lawful impediments to be placed on British merchants seeking to recoup debts from Americans. That means all contracts are still valid. If you had debt to a British merchant before the war, you still owe that British merchant money, whatever it is you owed him. So the end of the war does not invalidate any contract or any prior agreement, private agreement. Now, once the end of the war has been negotiated, now the Americans have to establish a government and exist on their own 2 feet. So the first form of government that was established, even not just at the end of the war, but when the war began, was the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, um, of course the states were completely sovereign. The national government had no real power, and so the national government was weak. But there were some things that the that the states did even before, at the same time as establishing the Articles of Confederation. Most of them created their own individual constitutions. They included a Bill of Rights, which of course will translate later into the United States Constitution, property qualifications, separation of powers, 3 branches of government. And many of the ideas that were put forth in these new state constitutions, uh, they're ideas and concepts that would be translated over into the U.S. Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation, as I mentioned before, there was state sovereignty. The states had the final say in all matters, for their own states. There was a single legislature and in that legislature, each state had one vote, and there was no executive or judicial branch. So there was a legislative branch to make the laws, but no executive branch to carry out the laws, and no judicial branch to interpret the laws and adjudicate the laws. Uh, so some problems under the Articles of Confederation. Well, there's a lot of problems, but the biggest problem was there was no power to tax and collect money, and no power to regulate commerce. The United States government had accumulated debt in the war, and the only way to pay back that debt was to collect taxes. And these debts were to other nations. And you're a new country on the world stage, you must pay back your debt to have any legitimacy. But there was no power to tax, so they could not pay back their debt. And they had no power to regulate commerce between the states. So you began seeing trade wars and conflicts between the different states over trade and tariffs and things like that. And also, it was difficult passing laws. You know, it takes under the Articles, it took 9 of 13 votes, one vote per state, to pass any law. And you have to realize how different the early states were. The southern states were so very different from the New England states, and the middle states around the Chesapeake area were different in their own right, and they had very little in common. So they had very little area to find common ground. But there were some successes of the early Articles of Confederation government. It established the principles of limited government. It established the idea that government cannot do whatever it wants to, and that there are written restrictions and written borders placed on what government can do. Uh, Under the Articles of Confederation, the government spelled out, citizenship requirements, and maybe most importantly, they were successful in mapping out a plan to settle the new frontier, the new Western territory that they accumulated up to the Mississippi River, what we know as the Ohio Valley for the most part. But they were able to set up a system that could, at least in some formal process, settle the Western frontier. One of the things passed by the Articles of Confederation government was the Land Ordinance of 1785, which kind of spelled out how settlements would be established in the frontier, and basically any new township would be set up in a grid pattern, and it would be 36 sections of 640 acres, which is 1 square mile each. And these really 36 square miles, 6 miles by 6 miles, and these would be sold, and they could be sold to individuals to own themselves, or to speculators who could break them up into smaller sections, as we see on the right: half sections, quarter sections, half quarter sections, and quarter sections, and sell them separately. But one thing that was required is that one 640 acre or 1 square mile section must be reserved for the support of public education. So that early on, the government wanted to ensure that public education of its citizens had some type of support or funding. Now, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 also provided for the structure of government in the Northwest Territories, what we call the Northwest Territories. And it went something like this: territories would be ruled by a governor that was appointed by the Articles of Confederation Congress, and a secretary and 3 judges, all appointed by Congress. The Once you reached a population of 5,000 in your territory, you can elect an assembly to make laws for yourselves. But at this point, the appointed governor still had an absolute veto over anything you did. But at the population level of 60,000, excuse me, when population reached 60,000, you may write a constitution and apply for statehood. And of course, as soon as any territory reached 60,000 population, that's the first thing they did. They wanted to be part of the United States. They wanted to be a state in the United States. And one of the most progressive things that the Continental, not the Continental Congress, but the Articles of Confederation Congress did, was make it make it to where all new states came in on equal status as the older states, the original colonies. They didn't have to do that. They could have required, a process, but once you became a state, you entered the Union as an equal state. Then these new states had trial by jury and religious freedom to an extent for both, and slavery was outlawed in the early Northwest Ordinance of these new states in the Northwest Territory. And so the states under the Articles of Confederation, they were sovereign. They kind of existed on their own. The national government itself was weak, and it remained weak. And everybody knew that in the long run, they would have to make a stronger national government in order to establish their legitimacy on the world stage. But they never really got around to doing it until something called Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion, which happened in 1787, was an uprising of basically poor and middle class farmers who had the new constitutions in the state of Massachusetts had placed the debt burden of paying off the Revolutionary War debt onto the farmers. They also began to foreclose on farmers who got into arrears on their payments during the Revolution. A lot of these men that fought in the Revolution left their farms to their family to support the war effort, and and they assumed it was understood that because they were fighting for independence and fighting for the war effort, that they would not be punished by having their farms foreclosed on if they got into arrears on their payments, during the war. But they began foreclosing on the farms, and so Daniel Shays, a veteran of the American Revolution, organized about 1,200 of his fellow farmers, and they marched on Springfield, Massachusetts, and basically shut down the government, took over all the government offices, shut down all the foreclosure proceedings, and basically took over the state of Massachusetts. Well, the state legislature tried to call out a militia, but many of the militia were part of Shays Rebellion. So they sent word to the national government that they needed help, and the national government told them, "Well, we don't have an army. We don't have any way to protect you because we can't collect taxes, and it's only through taxes that we can maintain an army or maintain security." So this scared the elites of all the states to their core, because they while this was a minor rebellion, if you will, it also showed them what could potentially happen if there was a major rebellion. Instead of having Daniel Shays, who was just a mediocre military leader, veteran, enlisted veteran from the Revolutionary War, what if and him and a bunch of you know dirt farmers took over a state? What would happen if there was a motivated, dynamic, real military leader, and it wasn't just 1,200, it was 12,000 or 30,000? They could take over every single state in the country because there was no strong central government to stop them. So this put fear into the elites of all the states because they fear that the poor might rise up against the wealthy, and there's no way to stop them. So so they decided to have a constitutional convention. They met in Philadelphia. Two plans were put forth early on. First, the Virginia plan, which wanted to establish a completely new government um, and give larger states more power within that government and make for a stronger central government. The New Jersey plan wanted to really maintain the Articles of Confederation because that benefited the smaller states like New Jersey because each state had one vote. So Virginia, of course, wanted the legislature to be um, proportional to the populations of the states, meaning that the national legislature, uh, in the national legislature, whatever state had the most population would have the most seats in the legislature. It was based on how much population you had. Well, that's great for the big states, but the small states liked it the way it was because a small state like New Jersey or Rhode Island, who had much fewer people living in it than, say, New York or Virginia, had the same amount of influence and power in the national government. So the Great Compromise during the Constitutional Convention was negotiated, and it basically split the difference. You'd have a bicameral legislature, two houses in the legislature, the national legislature. Um, One would be based on population, the lower house, the House of Representatives. So states like Virginia that had the most population would also have the most seats in Congress. And then the Senate, the other house, would each state would have an equal number of votes, and it took both to pass any law. Also, was part of the Great Compromise, Three-Fifths Compromise, under the how the House of Representatives was established in the proportional representation. If the southern states were to allowed to count all of their slaves as persons, they would have had a majority in the House of Representatives, but the North would not allow that. The North argued that, well, you don't give your slaves any rights of citizenship. You treat them as property, so therefore you should not be able to count them as persons when determining representation. So the compromise there will be called the Three-Fifths Compromise, where basically for every five slaves that live in a state, they could count three for purposes of representation in Congress. And that compromise gave the southern slave states more seats in Congress or in the House of Representatives, but didn't give them a majority. And then the great debate begins over whether to pass this new Constitution, and it's between the Federalists who supported the Constitution as it is, and the Anti-Federalists who did not. And the greatest thing to come out of the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists is the Federalist Papers, which basically explains how the new national government would work. And every person that is interested in American politics or the American governmental structure or American history should read the Federalist Papers because it's very clear on the purpose of the government. Finally ratified in 1788. Washington is elected in 1788. And then the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, are added in 1791. And that Bill of Rights was added basically to get, first it took 9 of the 13 to ratify the Constitution. But in order to get the 4 left over that refused to ratify it, they had to pass the Bill of Rights and add the Bill of Rights to provide protection for states and individuals from government power. And